Hi students, in this video we're going to talk about Marion Hourdequin's Climate, Collective Action, and Individual Ethical Obligations. So this paper that Marion Hourdequin wrote is a response to Walter Sinnott Armstrong's paper, where you'll remember Sinnott Armstrong argued that although we have an obligation to work to pass sort of climate regulations and lower emissions, we don't have an individual obligation to reduce our own emissions, and Hourdequin's going to argue against that. So when we take a look at what Hourdequin's thesis says, we find that she argues contra Sinnott Armstrong, which just means against, or sort of for an opposing view, that we're not only obligated to work towards collective solutions to the climate change problem, but also morally obligated to reduce our individual greenhouse gas emissions, even if those emissions wouldn't cause harm. So what she's going to do is grant Sinnott Armstrong some of the main claims that his argument depends on. So one is that our greenhouse gas emissions don't cause harm. She just says, sure, let's assume that that's true. She also assumes with Sinnott Armstrong that we have this obligation to work towards collective solutions to the climate change problem. She's going to sort of use that to her advantage. Now, one thing that's worth thinking about, right, from the outset, again, maybe returning to at the end, is this question about, well, what does Hourdequin's thesis entail exactly? So, presumably entails we shouldn't joyride, but again, that's really not the mass amount of emissions. Joyriding, I'm sure, makes up just a minuscule fraction of the total emissions in the world. And so she's gonna, her conclusion entails that we shouldn't go joyriding, but I think it goes further than that, right? So if Hourdequin's right, sort of what other things must we do and or avoid doing? This is something, right, that's worth thinking about sort of on your own. I'm going to suggest a few possibilities, and the ones that the ideas I'm suggesting here are going to be some of the big ones, right? So one of the biggest things you can do is to change the way that you eat. So eating meat and other sort of animal products is one of the biggest drivers of climate change and emissions. So eating a more plant-based diet is one thing you could do to limit your own individual emissions. That's not the only thing though, right? So how you get around is also really important. Here we've got a picture of a electric car, and it seems like buying something like an electric car, going without a car altogether, biking, walking, things like that, that's also going to reduce your emissions. Public transportation, things along those lines, anything like that is going to help. Another big one here is the heating and cooling that you do of your home. So one big energy intensive activity that we engage in is keeping our houses warm, or in the summer, warm in the winter, cool in the summer. And so the less we use that thermostat, the less we use that heating and cooling system, the better off we are. And then finally, there are some other things that we could do, right? So maybe we could have buy less stuff. That would have an impact. Here I've got a picture of a "No Children Allowed" sign. Could it be that Hourdequin's thesis entails that we aren't allowed to have kids? I have a few kids, 3, more than your fair share, Dr. Spellman, and so you might know where I stand on that. I think it's okay to have kids, but I think the arguments against having kids are pretty compelling, and so they're worth taking seriously and figuring out if there's a problem with those arguments, what exactly the problem is. All right, so we've got some things in mind: joyriding, eating a plant-based diet, reducing the energy in our transportation, the way we get around, using that thermostat less, and reducing consumption, whether that's through not having kids or just buying less stuff. Those are some things that Hourdequin's thesis entails. So how does Hourdequin argue for this thesis? Hourdequin follows Sinna Armstrong in assuming that we have this obligation to work towards collective solutions to the climate change problem. So she grants him that. From there, she argues that we have a moral obligation to have integrity and or avoid hypocrisy. Right? They're sort of two heads of the same coin. Now, that claim that we have this obligation to have integrity or avoid being hypocrites, right? That's doing a lot of work for her. So, given that it would be hypocritical to work towards collective solutions to the climate change problem without reducing your own emissions, right? People would call you a hypocrite if you were to do that. Hourdequin concludes that we have this obligation to reduce our individual emissions. So we're going to look into what exactly it means to have integrity, what it means to avoid hypocrisy. So what is integrity? Integrity, according to Hourdequin, has two aspects, integrality and integration. So Hourdequin points out that the concept of integrity hasn't been sort of looked into that much, but she draws on the work of some other philosophers to talk about these two aspects of it. So let's start with integrality. One's commitment to some value, X, is integral when one has internalized that value. That is, when one acts on it or acts in accordance with it without deliberation. So here I want to use an example from my own experience. Right? Back when I was in grad school, I guess, I decided one Lent to give up eating meat. There were a lot of my friends who didn't eat meat. I thought, it's the right thing to do. Let's try it. Let's see how hard it is. And when you do that, right, when you give up something, whether it's meat or Facebook or chocolate or whatever it is, it's hard at the beginning, and you got to think about it. Right? You've got to sort of make a mental decision. Now, this is true of anything that's addictive, right? Alcohol, drugs, right? These things that suck us in a bit. So, commitment to something, not drinking, not eating meat, and not going on Facebook, whatever it is, it's integral when we don't have to deliberate about it. We don't have to sort of check ourselves because we're constantly feeling that temptation to do it. Second, one's commitment to a value, X, whatever that is integrated when it coheres with the rest of one's commitments. So it's possible that we could be committed to something, and I think even have that commitment be integral, right? We act on it without deliberation, even though it's not coherent and with the rest of our commitments. So one thing you might think of is honesty, right? We can think of someone who's brutally honest and or honest to a fault. They're committed to telling the truth, and there's a way in which that might manifest itself naturally. But what we need to do is to sort of integrate that commitment to the truth with the rest of our commitments. So we don't want to be brutally honest, right? We want to be honest in the right approach, right amount. Same with other commitments, So going back to the example, my example, right, of giving up eating meat. So I gave up meat primarily for sort of animal welfare and animal ethics kinds of reasons. I thought it's wrong to support an industry that harms animals. But someone could easily point out, right, that the dairy industry has, some of the maybe even worse effects, harms on animals than eating animals. So, it took years, right, to eventually change from eating a vegetarian diet to eating a vegan diet. And the thought is that, there were a couple reasons for that, right? Maybe one, for a long time, I maybe wanted to change, but I also thought, well, the situation that I'm in is one where eating a vegan diet would put additional burdens on the people around me, in particular, right, the people I live with, my wife and my kids. That would make all of our lives harder, and is it worth it? Right, that's something we have to think about. But ideally, we want to work towards integration, where we've got sort of our commitments are all in alignment, and we feel good, we're acting the way that we want to. And so one thing to note here, right, is that when our family ended up starting to eat vegan and continuing with that, right, there's a sense in which like there's a settling there, like there's no conflict in my values. And so that's that's one thing for me that's been significant, but everybody has their own sort of environmental commitments and things that they need to integrate, right? So um, is that your vehicle use? Is it the stuff you buy? So maybe you think, yeah, people should buy less stuff, but man, those clothes that are on sale at H&M or whatever look great, and I'd want to buy some of those. How do we start to integrate those commitments that we have? Okay, so last thing to note here is just that having integrity isn't easy. So Hourdequin, gives an example. One is committed to racial equality, doesn't guarantee that you're going to treat racial minorities equally and or support policies that are necessary to achieve racial equality. So someone might say, like, I'm not racist. I think that white people and colored people are all the same. But we might have implicit biases, right, that affect the way that we interact with people whose color of skin is different than ours. We might not support the sorts of policies that we need in order to bring about racial equality. And so just because you're committed to something or you think something's right doesn't mean you have integrity. Now, why is integrity valuable? Hourdequin sort of talks about a number of different ways in which having integrity can be valuable. So she uses the example of biking. It's actually a picture of the bike that I own. That's not my bike, but it's the kind of bike that I own. And she says, what's the value in riding a bike? Even though it might not reduce that much harm, as Senna Armstrong points out. So why should we do it? One is that it might encourage other people to ride bikes. So not only are you cutting down on your carbon emissions, but you're cutting down on other people's carbon emissions as well. Even if it doesn't get other people to bike, they might be more conscientious. They might think more carefully about the decisions they make and how those decisions are going to affect the environment. And maybe it leads someone to buy a more fuel efficient car or something along those lines, right? If maybe they're not biking more, but they're being more thoughtful about what they're doing, and they make purchasing decisions and things like that are significant, that have a good impact. Now, there are some other reasons why integrity is valuable, not just sort of the effects that it's going to have on other people and their decisions. It's also going to contribute to kind of like psychological harmony and give life meaning, purpose. So there's a way in which when you go through life having a certain sort of value or a thing that you hold dear, but you're not fully acting in accordance with that, there's a kind of way in which that causes psychological disharmony, and living with integrity gets rid of that. It also, living with integrity helps others make sense of your behavior, and it helps them or encourages them to take your arguments more seriously. So we see this with people who argue against eating meat, but eat meat themselves. There's a kind of discontinuity there. Hourdequin talks about Al Gore, who flew around the country, doing these public speaking events, about how we should reduce our emissions. Well, when someone's flying, which is one of the most emissions intensive activities you can do, to tell us to reduce our emissions, seems like there's a kind of hypocrisy there. And she points out it's especially uh, hypocritical when you are telling people to change their sort of individual behaviors, and then your individual behaviors are not eco-conscious. So there's another, I guess, one other example that's worth mentioning is Peter Singer, who argues for donating to famine relief, and then people always point out, well, Singer, you look really well dressed, you know. I guess you're not really spending all your money on famine relief like you tell us that you should. And there are arguments and defensible, a defense that he can kind of give as to why he's not walking around in rags. But in a way, not having that integrity potentially opens you up to objections or encourages people to take you less seriously. Okay, so that brings us to Hourdequin's argument for a duty to reduce our individual emissions. The first premise of that argument is pretty plausible. It's the premise that she's been arguing for much of the paper. We're morally obligated to demonstrate integrity. Sounds right. Premise 2, integrity requires us to bring our political and individual behaviors into alignment. So we've got to have coherence between what we're working towards on the political level, what we're working towards on the individual level. Conclusion number 1, we're morally obligated to bring our political and individual behaviors into alignment. All right, so that conclusion goes there. That conclusion is going to serve as a premise, right, in a larger argument. So the argument continues with premise 3. We're morally obligated to work towards reducing global emissions. So that's a political requirement, right? We've got this obligation to work on the political level towards reducing global emissions. And if we're obligated to bring our political work into alignment with our individual behaviors, then the conclusion is that we're obligated to work towards reducing individual emissions, right? Not just global emissions, but we got to work towards reducing our individual emissions as well. Now, you'll remember from a little while back this prisoner's dilemma. We talked about this is kind of the situation we're in with climate change, right? Emitting a lot, reducing our emissions. So defecting is emitting a lot, reducing our emissions is cooperating. If everybody else is cooperating, right, we're going to get a big benefit from not reducing our emissions, right? We're going to have a benefit over everyone else. If everyone else is defecting like us, right, then we don't really get much of a benefit. But there's not much harm, right? We're no worse off than anyone else. Now, if we cooperate and everyone else cooperates, that's a benefit. But that's unlikely to happen, right? So there are going to be some people out there who are failing to cooperate, and so if we cooperate, we're losing, right, to those people in some sense. So when it comes to should I reduce my emissions, it does seem like, well, no, I don't have to sacrifice while other people get ahead. I'm allowed to defect. What I need to do is to fight for change so that the incentive structure changes. But I think what Hourdequin's arguing is that if we develop integrity, and this is a virtue ethical argument at the end of the day, I think it's important to note that. So she's arguing that we should develop this virtue of integrity. If we have that, that's going to make us act in a different way. And if we develop that, I think there's this sort of additional feature here that we need to take into consideration. So if we take integrity into account, right, we're going to feel good about cooperating, about reducing our emissions. If we really integrated that value, this care and concern for limiting emissions, then we're going to feel bad about emitting a lot. So even though there might be this payoff relative to other people, there's this harm that we're experiencing. Whereas if we cooperate, right, that makes us feel good. And so even though we might be losing out compared to other people, we feel good about that. And that's what's sort of more important. Right? So we might think about these, the smiley faces are a positive, and the frowny faces are negative or something. So it ends up that really what it's in our self-interest to do only once we've integrated these values, integrated care and concern for the environment. Once we've done that, though, then it makes sense and it's rational for us to cooperate, even if other people aren't. One sort of example or way I like to think about this when it comes to food. Right? So I teach a food ethics class. I taught a lot about the ethics around what we eat, and so I think we see this sort of prisoner's dilemma playing out in something like farmers markets. So in the farmers market, we see people who have made a decision that, yeah, we see organic eggs, right, $4 a dozen. In a sense, this isn't the most cost-effective way to get eggs. It's cheaper to just go to the grocery store and buy eggs that aren't organic, eggs that are raised, laid by hens in factory farms. But they're sort of opting out of the system. They're saying, I can't, given my values, I can't continue to do that. So I'm going to support something different. I'm going to support these farmers markets. And so in a way, they're losing, right? In a way, they're losing out to the people who are getting eggs cheaper than them. But it feels good for them to do that, and they're committed to sort of changing the world one person at a time. Whether or not that actually makes much of a difference, it's not clear. Maybe Senator Armstrong's right. Maybe that doesn't make much of a difference. But it's the thing that they're committed to do and they feel like they have to do given the situation. So hopefully that gives you a sense for where Marion Hourdequin's coming from, why her argument for reducing our individual emissions is persuasive, and why we might think we should do that even if it's not going to have a significant impact as far as pleasure and pain overall is concerned. For next time, I would encourage you to read John Broom's Private Morality and Climate Change and complete the associated reading quiz. We'll see you then.